right. So, welcome everybody to season 2, episode 1 of the Rooster's Crow podcast. Again, it is an engagement with ideas, people, and culture that, like the Rooster's Crow, is both sounding the alarm, but also calling towards repentance, metanoia, reorientation, transformation. Today, I have a very special guest, someone that's very gracious with his time, Professor Todd McGowan. And a little bit on Todd here. He teaches film and critical theory in the English department at the University of Vermont. He has written books in the intersection of psychoanalytic theory, German idealism, cinema, and literature. They include The End of Dissatisfaction, The Impossible David Lynch, and The Real Gaze, Film Theory After Lacan. He was also the co-editor of Lacan and Contemporary Film. He's written a book on the idea of atemporal cinema and a book on the political implications of psychoanalytic theory. His most recent book that I came across that I read and I really appreciated was Enjoyment Left and Right. And I found it interesting and really open to engagement. A lot of ideas there kind of stood out to me. So, Todd, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, James. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. And I saw your recent conversation with Michael Downs and on Theory Underground. I think the three of you talking about non-belonging, and the spirit of that conversation was something that has been missing from the left. I've been politically homeless since 2015, 2016, really. And we need conversations like that to kind of re-engage. And I think your book, Enjoyment Right and Left, really speaks to this contemporary contradictions in the political discourse. And I'd like to get into that as well. But before we get there, so I've kind of had this relationship. I've been reading Lacan against the Eastern Orthodox Church Fathers, which is a kind of a strange marriage. And I've been sharing videos and readings and analysis on my YouTube page, probably for about 4 or 5 other people in the world that are interested in this convergence.
Okay.
So some things that kind of stood out, in comparison, right? So we have this idea of, so we're going to get into a lot of stuff here first that I have questions that we're not going to get into because that's what usually happens. So I'm just going to get it out here. So
Okay.
the self, the ego versus the personhood in Christianity, the mirror stage and idol worship, the psychoanalytic theory of subjectivity and hypostasis, alienation and the fall and sin, the incest taboo in Genesis. And I really want to get into desire. So desire versus the passions, small object A versus the passions. I see there's a lot of resonances there. Sexuation, Adam and Eve, the name of the Father, and the ability to give names as Adam was given that ability. I really want to hopefully get into the other versus the neighbor, love the neighbor as yourself versus the psychoanalytic concept of the other, the death drive versus the fall, sublimation versus transfiguration. And these are just some things that I've been kind of thinking through. And then some questions that kind of popped up, or some more topics that we're not going to get into here, but I wanted to put on the table: belonging and philaphtia, which is the love of self, the universality of non-belonging, enjoyment and the passions. What is emancipation from what towards what? The nature of contradiction, antinomies, and the mysteries. Small object A and the economy of ideological capture. And I have many, many others, but what I really want to start, if you will, I want to know about Todd McGowan. I'd like to know about your upbringing, the relationship with your parents, and in a social and religious context, through the question, who was Todd McGowan in high school?
High school. Okay. So I grew up just a little bit before that, I'll go, because I grew up in a fundamentalist household, and my parents were so radically religious that my mom would send me into, this is a very traumatic memory of my youth. She would send me into the male bathroom with a bunch of tracts. I don't know what those are. They're like, have Bible verses and things on them, and you have to be saved. And she would tell me to put them around on the toilet seats, because she couldn't go in there because it was the men's bathroom. So that's one of my earliest terrible memories. But I should say that my parents were pretty great, and I got along with them. And in fact, my mom just died, and my girlfriend from high school was like, she just said to me, she was closer to me than my own mother was. So she was very my parents were people in the high school thought they were cool. Like people came over their house. They didn't mind if, I I I had a couple something to drink or something, so they were pretty cool. But then in high school, I was I played football. I was a sort of a joker. I got suspended from high school for coming to school drunk. I was a kind of a not a not a, I was, but I did well grade wise, but I just wasn't serious. And so in fact, I was such a joker that I turned in a paper on the Scarlet Letter in 11th grade English, and the teacher wrote me back, you did not write this. She just, and of course I didn't plagiarize it, but she just assumed I did because I was such a joker in class. But then I met this guy who was two people. So my English teacher in my senior year was very committed to existentialism, and so she gave me Camus and Sartre and things, and so was this minister that I had at the church that we went to, and he got me to read. He found a used copy of Soren Kierkegaard's Train in Christianity, and that book basically changed my whole life. And I wanted to, when I first went to college, I wanted to become a monk, but that gradually dropped away. But so I read Kierkegaard, I read Augustine, I read Thomas Merton. That was the real monk influence. So that's but I played football in high school and then in college, and even in college I still dreamt of being so I wanted to do ever since I was a little boy. I wanted to be a professional football player. So but then I wasn't big enough. So that was a dream not realized. So then I just went to grad, and then sorry, you asked about high school. So that was high school.
What position did you play?
I was an offensive guard. So I was in college. I weighed about 240. I was about 195 pounds more than I am now. So
Wow.
I realized that for my dad died of a heart attack. I thought it'd probably be a good idea to lose a little weight. so
Yeah.
I did. Yeah.
Wow, that's thank you for sharing that. I have a
Yeah.
passion for football as well, and I too was a jokester in high school. I got suspended and actually kind of expelled about a month before graduation. I was allowed to come back and kind of finish. Same thing with partying and being an idiot. But now I have a passion for football. I coach Little League, Pop Warner football. My
Oh
son,
wow, cool.
he's
That's great.
quarterback. He's 8. He loves it, and
Ah,
there's something about football and the ability to build community that is absent in so many ways now. So I've really met some great parents and coaches and really bringing young men and boys and together in the spirit of competition and egalitarianism. There's not a lot of community left, even churches now, there's not a lot of places to gather. And it's
right.
it's
Right.
one of the rare places that are kind of
I
left
agree
here.
with you. It's a great point. I think, don't you think it's maybe part of the spirit of pickleball and why it's taken off? There's a kind of
Mhm.
communal aspect to it. I'm a tennis player, so I inherently hate pickleball players, but I do appreciate the way that it is a kind of communal. They get together, they bring their lawn chairs. There's a kind of, it's nice.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it does speak to this absence, that's this felt
yeah,
absence that a lot of
yeah.
people kind of feel. Can you talk about a little bit about your kind of the phenomenological experience of Christianity from your upbringing in this fundamentalist perspective, and then how that changed, and then how was that transformed when encountering Kierkegaard?
Yeah, so Kierkegaard and Merton and Augustine Kierkegaard's a Protestant, but they turned me toward Catholicism. So that was a big shift, and that was a shift that upset my father. My mother ended up converting, and that upset my father too. I had a very close Oedipal bond with my mother, so whatever I did, she kind of did too. Um, and then so in college, I went to mass every Sunday, even after I was totally drunk the night before. I would get up and go to mass. Uh, and then I have to say two different experiences. So first, reading Nietzsche was a kind of shook my Christianity, and then reading Freud really shook it. And so that kind of didn't necessarily eliminate it, but it just made me not a. But then I have to say, when I was working on this book on Hegel, uh, that brought me back to a different kind of relationship to Christianity. So that so that's kind of the trajectory. Like there was a long period where I was sort of not thinking about that, although I still would, I was pretty active reading I know the Bible pretty well. I would read the New Testament. Old Testament I kind of let go, but I read New Testament pretty religiously, if I could put it that way. And but then getting into Hegel, I that opened up a whole other way of thinking about Christianity for me, which was really important.
Yeah, that's interesting trajectory. I too early on, I started actually applied to the University of Florida to get off probation because I got a DUI, and I got there and never encountered philosophy or theory or anything. And then I took a political theory class and I had to take two of them because that's all that was left because I was late applying. And for somehow I just fell in love, and I'm like, oh my God, it just opened my eyes. And it was an existentialism class that really kind of did it there, and through Nietzsche, big time. And I've changed my relationship with Nietzsche because I think he's done a favor to Christianity because he's identified and outlined the contradictions in Christianity as it was kind of revealed in the 18th, 19th century through the Protestant Revolution. Right. So I think Freud did as well. I think Freud did a lot to open up a reorientation, ironically, to Christianity because of the way that he was engaging with the psyche, right? And with talk therapy. It's a talk therapy is confession, and from the Eastern Orthodox perspective, a true confession, a true spiritual father and a true confessor is very hard to find these days. They're very rare. But I think it's interesting to look at what happens in confession when you are with a spiritual father who is there as a sinner with you, and you are, free associating, right? When you free associate, you're talking about, there is nothing free about free association, because what comes up usually is what's bothering you. What's bothering you is your sin, right? And your sin, the Greek sin is amartia, which means to miss the mark. So where you're missing the mark is coming up, and from a true confessor, is there with you, and there's a transformation that happens as you confess your sins that reorients the heart. And I think that Freud, who rediscovered talk therapy in this more kind of materialist sense, opened up a kind of a reorientation towards that. So I see, and Lacan as well, which is strange, I see him as doing a lot of service to the future of Christianity. His brother was a Christian,
he was a monk, actually.
Was a monk, and I think he tried to get audience with the Pope on 2 different occasions.
Yeah.
Right. So,
and he had numerous priests in his seminars. I don't know if you know that, but yeah, he had a very complicated relationship to the Catholic Church. I mean, which was the only church he would have, because in France, basically, that's there's no Protestantism. I mean, more or less.
Mm-hmm. And there's really no orthodoxy.
No.
So my parents moved here quickly from Greece. They were both immigrants. They didn't know the language. So they moved here while my mom was pregnant with me, and settled here in Florida. And they ended up working in the restaurant business and owning their own restaurants. But I was raised by my grandparents who spoke no English, and we would go to Orthodox church every Sunday. And I loved it. And I would go as a child till about 12. And then I fell away completely. I never became an atheist, but then I really started getting interested in later on in philosophy and science, and the philosophy of science, and then psychoanalysis, and Heidegger was a big influence on me. So, and then about 5 years ago, the whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon, the way that he looked at the psychological significance of the Bible, gave it a window to look at it through kind of a new lens. And I found the work of Jonathan Pageau. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He does a lot of work on symbolism, and the term symbolism. And this is another resonance here. The Greek term symboli means to throw together. So in this church, the symbolic is where the appropriate mediation of heaven and earth orient, right? Because heaven and earth are thrown together, and this happens and is mediated. The perfect example of this is Christ, right? Christ is the perfect mediation of heaven and earth. So he is a symbolic representation of how to orient yourself with other human beings. And, and something like the 10 Commandments, which I ridiculed for so long, seems to me, a kind of a basic cultural code to build civilization. I used to think, have no God other than me. Is he a jealous God? Don't fornicate with, your neighbor's wife. What are these? Why would these be the things and all these thou shalt not? But it's like, if you do these basic 10 things, just these basic 10 things, right, as the bedrock of your civilization, then you can build bespoke civilizations, technological civilizations in any different way. Who knows what can come of it? But, if you're truthful with each other, you don't cheat on each other, right? You're faithful with each other. And what really stood out was this idea of the first and the second commandment. And I see it, I engage with the first two commandments when I read psychoanalysis, because the first one is, thou shalt not have God, any other God over me, and y'all shall not build idols. And the way that I think about idols is as ideology and the first commandment is related to the second, because if you're not plugged in to the infinite mystery, which is essentially unnameable, if you're not worshiping appropriately, you will worship. Human beings cannot but worship, right?
Yeah.
And by worship, I mean, invest our desire into something that orients our identity. And if that's not done appropriately, right, then there's going to be disorientation, there's going to be disintegration, and the contradiction at the very center of human identity will not be kind of the comportment towards this contradiction will not be done in a way that well-being flourishes for you and your family and your community. And I really see that this idea of don't build idols, right? And don't build idols. They're not just statues or golden calves. They're ideas, they're relationships. Even Orthodox Christianity, which I'm an Orthodox Christian, can become an idol. So it's very kind of pernicious. And why I like the psychoanalytic framing is because it deals kind of with the economy of ideology, and Slavoj Žižek, of course. And so I was wondering if you resonate or how you make of Slavoj's Christian atheism.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much follow Slavoj. More or less. I think it's interesting that I would say that I'm more agnostic than he is. Like, I don't have his vehement atheism, because what's interesting to me is that he'll like give this theorization of Christianity, and then he'll say, yeah, but I'm a materialist atheist. But there's no real theorization of that. And so it is interesting that one is sort of theoretically developed, the other is not. Just to speak to what you just said about the first two, I think that the first two commandments, I think that's pretty interesting, because especially if you see God as a some fundamental absence or figure of what Lacan would call the real, right? Then what that first commandment would be saying would be, don't set up any symbolic structure that work functions as a master to obfuscate that impossible position of the real. And then the second one would be kind of sort of interesting, right? Like the graven image or the idol would be, well, that would be something imaginary, right? Just like you're saying, like an idol. But it's like one is about the symbolic and the other is about the imaginary. And they're both about obfuscating this God of the real. Like for Plato, I think Plato's sort of interesting too, because the ideal forms for him are not, I think he gets wrongly thought of as someone who, there's in this other realm, these ideal forms. But he's pretty clear that the ideal forms are just what's not perceptible to us, right? So there's a sense in which I think that conception resonates with Christian idea of God. And then the idea I like so much about Christianity is that imperceptibility of the beyond comes down in the figure of Christ, and so it's among us, right? And so it's in your fellow person, that precisely that imperceptible God, right? Like, and I think that's what Christ calls Holy Spirit. So I think that's pretty great. And I think what you're saying about the Ten Commandments works really well if you can think about them. I think obviously there's, what's that guy's name? Roy Moore, who nailed them up to his court. Like, I think like he's clearly thinking of them in a different way, but I think I really like the idea of interpreting that, like giving an interpretation of them so that you see like, oh, there's really something else going on, not just this punitive structure to basically to put people that he doesn't think are desirable into prison. So I think I think I really like that idea of trying to get an interpretation that, pushes it in and grasps the way in which it's relevant for us today, in this, not in this utterly, I don't know, fascistic way that it often gets articulated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the 10th commandment to not covet your neighbor's goods. So I've had this idea. I've been reading McLuhan against Girard and Lacan, and I had this kind of title of a potential avenue of thought, which is the model, the discourse, and the meme, the mediation of desire through the other in the works of McLuhan, Lacan, and Girard. And McLuhan saw desire as mediated through technology. Girard saw desire as mediated through the other in mimetic processes, right? And
Right.
Lacan, of course, said that desire is the desire of the other. So what's salient in all three of these, and from a Christian perspective, McLuhan and Girard basically said that the answer is Christ, in a very radical way. That if you imitate anyone else, you're going to fall into this, from a Girardian perspective, this mimetic line that leads to violence. Right. And McLuhan as well. If you build, we build models of the world, we invest our desire, technically from a McLuhan perspective, and it leads to violence as well if we don't do it appropriately. And I think it's wrestling with this idea of what it means to follow Christ, and how that short circuits the kind of mimetic and disintegrating force of desire. And I think you have a beautiful kind of expose of in your book of The Heathers, the movie The Heathers, the 1989 film. And I see that as a beautiful description of the appropriate political orientation of the Christian ethic, because Veronica is the Christ figure in the way that she doesn't, in the way that Christ came. When he came, he did not come and overtly overturn the order and become the new order. The Jewish community wanted a political leader to come and overcome, right? What did he do? He really embodied this central contradiction at the heart of human subjectivity, right? He trampled death by death, right? He is the embodiment of the infinite as a human person, and he was raised on the cross. He had a crown, which is something meant for kings of thorn, for kings as a thorn. So a crown of thorns. There's a lot of contradictions. Christ came and he went to the bottom of Sheol, of Hades, and rescued Adam and Eve, right? But he didn't take this new ideological form that you must follow me socially or politically and overcome your enemies. I think it really, that stood out to me in looking at Veronica. I guess we talk a little bit about the movie. It's kind of the first Mean Girls movie, where you have these three figures, these three female figures who are kind of like the snobby and cliquey high school figures, and it's kind of it's an interesting movie, but ultimately, and maybe we can use this as a framework to talk about your idea of non-belonging and something that, what I think I see on the left is this essentializing of the exception, right? And this idea of making non-belonging, or it's kind of keeping the relationship with the other while keeping the other distinct. And how do you see that particular kind of trope and Veronica and her role with regards to non-belonging, and how can we kind of think through that in terms of how we can orient ourselves politically?
Yeah, James, it's a great question. There's a lot of stuff there. So I think I like that parallel between Veronica and Christ. It's pretty good. And I think that it's important that and I like the crown of thorns, like that, all these contradictions of the figure of Christ, right? And that also that he is the infinite brought to the absolute lowest position, right? I think that's the key idea, that how would God manifest itself in the world? It would have to be in the lowest form, not in the highest form. And I think that's those who are first will be last. I mean, that's so many. Harder for the rich man to enter the kingdom of God than for a camel to enter the eye of the needle, right? Like all these ideas, I think, are all about that very thing. That it's not like, oh, being rich is bad. And no, it's about like that. How would God manifest itself in an earthly way? And I think it would be as the figure of lowliness. I think that's what Christ embodies. And then Veronica, it's the same thing, right? Like at first, although she, of course, because she's not Christ, at first she wants to be part of the popular group. And I think you're right that this is the paradigm. This movie is the paradigm for Mean Girls, which I also like. But if people say to me, "Oh, I love Mean Girls," I'm like, "Well, okay, but have you seen Heather? It's a little bit more radical." And the fact that's more radical is that the end of Mean Girls is like, "Oh, we all get along now; it's all nice." But the ending of Heather's is not that, right? Like the Veronica, I'll just repeat it for people that maybe haven't seen it. So Veronica wants to get in this Heather's group, but one of them dies, is murdered, and then there's a power shift, and another one of the Heathers at the end of the film is taken over the high school, and it's embodied by this red ribbon that she wears in her hair. And Veronica comes, and she looks terrible, and I think that's another important thing, because this other guy that was her boyfriend blew himself up, and he wanted to blow up the school. She thwarted that, and he blew himself up, and she's covered with soot and covered with ash, and she looks terrible. Her cigarette's burned out, and she comes and gives that Heather girl with the ribbon a kiss and gets her face all dirty, and then she takes the ribbon out of her hair and she goes, "There's a new sheriff in town." And then she goes and befriends the lowliest figure in the school, who everybody, the film begins with her being completely abased and made fun of. So and then she says, do you want to go come over to my house and watch some videos and pop some popcorn? And then that's how they're walking together down the hallway, and that's how the film ends. And it's great because it's exactly what you said. It's this like imitation, this Thomas à Kempis imitation of Christ, right? Like she's precisely, she wanted to be first, and now she's associated with the last, and that's I think you're right to see that as aligned with what I'm calling non-belonging in the book, and I do see that I mean, I think the real Christian idea is that everyone, and this idea that I agree with too, that everyone is a figure of non-belonging, and it's a question of like giving up that fantasy of trying to belong. And I think that's what Veronica does at the end of Heathers, which is why it's so great.
Yeah.
But you're right. I think one little quick thing. I think you're right that the left tends to hold on to some kind of fantasy of an alternative belonging, right? And I think that's a problem. Like, I think it has to be, to me, leftist politics is politics of non-belonging, whatever other people say.
Yeah, that resonates a lot, and I think this idea of the fantasy, I see the red ribbon as a sort of quilting point to take kind of from Lacan a little bit, and the Christian Slater this Christian Slater who plays the opposite Veronica, she's infatuated by him because he's different and he's not given into the social order, and he's like the Satan figure, right? Because ultimately what does he do, right? He wants to blow things up, but he's very attractive, right? Because he's different. And Veronica defeats him at the end, right? So it's like the sort of Christ defeating Satan at the end. I like this
through her fake suicide, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's the only way she's able to do it, right? She has to fake that she's killed herself. And so it's a really interesting, it's just like symbolic suicide that gives her I don't talk about this in the book at all, but it's really important, I think, that gives her the ability to defeat that figure.
And what Christ did, Christ wasn't murdered by the social forces that happened, but he sacrificed himself. And in doing so, the devil thought he won, right? The Christ went down to the bottom of hell, of Sheol, right? And then that's where the flip happened and reoriented, and rescued Adam and Eve. And the term Adam and Eve, the term Adam, I see it really fractally, and this is what I get from Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So the term Adam means an individual at the beginning of Genesis, but the term Adam also means humanity. So it's both a human and humanity. And the term Eve in Hebrew means life. So it's both this individual Eve and also life. So Christ came and rescued humanity and life, and kind of reoriented. And I see this idea of eating from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, right? From reading the church fathers, there were two trees in the Garden of Eden. There was and you're probably familiar with this, there was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there was the tree of life, the tree of immortality. The idea was that Adam and Eve were to eventually eat from the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil when they spiritually matured enough. And they were to remain in communion with God, who was walking among them, until they reached this point of spiritual maturity. Then they ate from the tree of life, which granted them immortality. Then they could properly orient civilization building by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because they've reached this spiritual maturity. And I see this idea of fantasy, of this idea of constantly investing our identity and desire in things of this world, this fallen world, as continuously coming back fractally to the fruit, eating from it. Things go great, and then they disintegrate, and then we keep coming back and eating from the fruit. The problem is we can't appropriate good and evil because of this, from this biblical perspective, because we don't have the spiritual maturity to do so. I found that very, very salient, and I found Lacan's kind of orientation of the symbolic order oriented through language, right? It's language that orients us into the symbolic order, but the symbolic order is the fallen symbolic order. It's necessarily fallen in a sense. And this idea of the split subject and sin, right? Sin, again, amartia, means to miss the mark. So
Right.
Lacan talks in, I think, seminar 2 about how, the elephant as the symbol, right? The elephant becomes more, the symbol of the elephant becomes more than the elephant itself, right? And that animals are oriented in their environment cogently and coherently. Human beings are not, because there's a split, there's a fundamental alienation at the heart of human subjectivity. I see that really resonate with this idea of sin is missing the mark, right? And from there, we enter the symbolic order, and we continuously build our identities and our communities with this splinter at the heart of our subjectivity. I find that salient, and I find that what is the solution that Lacan gives us? What is the goal of the psychoanalytic process? Has a lot to do with love, right? What is the I know there was this empty speech and full speech that he kind of went away from. What is, from your studies and understanding of Lacan, what is ultimately the goal of the psychoanalysis?
Well, it's to see. I think it's pretty. I think it's a little different, because I think for Lacan, sin would be, and fantasy would be the belief that you could escape your lack, right? So in a sense, Lacan thinks your lack is constitutive of you, right? That there's no like full subjectivity. There's no point at which you're complete. You emerge as a subject through the fact that you're lacking. So for him, analysis is about trying to find a way to come to terms with that. Try to find a way to get out of this dream of overcoming my status as lacking. And he also thinks that the symbolic doesn't, it's not like that we fall into the symbolic. The symbolic is constitutive of us, right? So for Lacan, there's no dream of getting out of that. So I think I think it's slightly different than the way that you framed it for him, for sure.
Yeah, I see this idea of lack, and I see that we're constitutive of the symbolic, but the symbolic itself is inherently has this lack within it, this inherent contradiction, right? So
right.
When we say that we're born sinners, it doesn't mean that we're born as inherently sick, as Christopher Hitchens would say, we're born sick and ordered well. It's more that we're born in a world that has this inherent contradiction, and we have to engage with this contradiction. And doing so in particular ways causes the lack of well-being and the lack of flourishing, both at the individual psychological level, the familial level, and the communal level. And I think it's this tarrying with contradiction, and obviously Hegel does this well. I think and what I would agree with this idea of resolving contradiction is the prideful moment, right?
Right. That would be disastrous, right? Like that would be disastrous if it happened. It's interesting. Like, I think that for Lacan, I mean, for me, I would say for me, I don't know, I wouldn't speak for Lacan, but I think that like embracing the contradiction, that's what that would be, and I think that's what I like about Christianity, right? That again, like Christ is this figure of the embodiment of contradiction. And so I think something like uh following Christ or imitating Christ, like it would be embracing contradiction, not trying to find a path out of it. Like I think, to me, if I had to say, if I had to define sin, it would be, sin is precisely this attempt to find a way to escape contradiction, right? Like that, isn't that how Christ is tempted? Like, oh, these are these ways out of contradiction. You can be Lord of the earth. You can, control it. So I don't know. I just think I would see it that way. I would see that, no, it's contradiction. That's the essence of, say, even the Christian project. And that, uh, I mean, for Hegel, God has to be contradictory or there couldn't be a creation, right? Like
Mhm.
that's his. So that's how I would. I guess that's how I would see it.
Yeah, so I think that it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, and this is where I kind of came to this thinking through the small object and the passions. You familiar with the idea of the Eastern Orthodox idea of the passions?
You probably have to help me.
So the passions are something, they're natural. They're very resonant with this idea of enjoyment, of this desire. But from a Eastern Orthodox, position, the goal is to overcome contradiction by accepting it. It's like the goal is to overcome the other by accepting the other. Right? It's not coming out of it in a sense. So the passions are, from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, are kind of the demons, right? We can think of it psychoanalytically as psychological forces that drive our enjoyment into a hyper excess, which causes the disintegration in our relationship. And the goal from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, through prayer, through the mysteries, the sacraments, is to work through the passions and with the passions, which are not inherently bad, but they are our path to salvation through the passions, right? And we do that through, what the monks do. They pray all the time, and there are monasteries, and they're praying, right? And so the idea of overcoming contradiction is working through the passions and working through our human desire, but we cannot do that intellectually, because we will build another idol, which is another identity we'll make out of it. So it's this idea of working through our desires, which are the engine of our desires are our passions, right? The engine of our desires from a Lacanian perspective is jouissance, is our enjoyment. And the question is, how do we, there has to be an acceptance of contradiction, and there has to be some sort of resolution of contradiction, but it can't be done intellectually, and it needs to be done in a way that, I see this consonant with the idea of belonging and non-belonging, right? If we make, the friend and enemy distinction that you talk about, which I think is a Schmittian idea, right?
Yeah.
Seems on the left or the right, there's always this shift, this parallax shift that happens, where there's another enemy that's created.
Absolutely.
And I think you say in your book that this is how the kind of the left wing inverts into the right wing when you start making, that's the contradiction inherent, right, in the social order, in a sense. We have to,
or it's a way of avoiding contradiction, right? Like because I think the whole point of contradiction is that it's an internal fissure, right? And so if you turn contradiction into an opposition between me and the enemy, then you're trying to avoid it, right? Like I think that's how I would put it, right? Like and I think you're right that there is this way in which the left, seemingly more today, but maybe that's an illusion of the present perspective, creates like turns people into enemies that we have to denounce, rather than saying, come over to our side and embrace this internal contradiction. Because I think that's the difference, right, between contradiction and opposition, which requires an enemy, whereas contradiction doesn't require an enemy because it's an internal fissure.
would you say it's both internal and social? Like it's
Yeah, but internal to the social, right? Like I think so there's a contradiction in, let's say, American society, but then there's an attempt to turn that contradiction into an opposition between, I don't know, America and China, right? Like So yeah. So every social structure also has an internal contradiction, just like every subject does.
Mhm. Yeah, I think the solution is not the right word, but the main commandments of Christ were to love God with all your heart, right? So plug into the infinite, the first commandment, right? And love your neighbor as yourself. So really, it's love your
I think those
neighbor.
have to be the same thing.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
related. They're completely they complement each other, right? Because you have to have both. And the idea of love your neighbor as yourself really is interpreted as love your neighbor as God loves you. So I don't know how we get through this without plugging back into God. And what we've seen with Christianity, which has disintegrated, the church and whatnot, as an aside, I see the same thing that happened with Christ, who had to die to be kind of resurrected. I think the same thing with the church. Christianity has to die in order to be resurrected as the kingdom. And we saw the first 1,000 years of Christianity was, one kind of body fighting off heresies, and then we had the schism in 1050, where Eastern Orthodox and Catholicism split. And then,
Mhm.
so that's the first split. And then the Protestant Revolution, we had another split, and then it fractured, right? And it's like kind of this fracturing process, fractal fracturing process. But I think at the end of that, there has to be, from a Christian perspective, a resurrection of the church, but it's going to come when it seems that the church has been defeated. But I think back to the two commandments, the solution is love. The solution is love, right?
Sure. Yeah.
But it's not like mushy love or romantic love. It's this ontological love that I can't speak to. Like you can't put it into words. But the idea of love your enemies, right? Like that's, if you love your enemies, you can short circuit this function of the contradiction, right? By including the other in the order without having to appropriate the other as one's own identity, or it becomes an enemy. So it's
Right.
this function of love, and this function of getting the relationship right with the other is the ultimate solution, I think, to appropriating contradiction at the heart of identity. I think that's at the individual level and at the social level. So it's about getting that right. And yeah, I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think it's right. I mean, I think that, Hegel has this, it's a little awkward formulation where he says identity is the identity of identity and difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's really great about that statement, and he wrote around 1800, a little before, little fragment on love, and basically for him, love becomes the concept. So he thinks that thinking conceptually is even an act of love because it attempts to see the way in which the other is identical with oneself and at the same time preserve the otherness of the other. And so that seems impossible, right? Like those are two contradictory things. But I think Hegel thinks that's the project of thinking even, and also the project of love. So I find that line very appealing, and I think that it is possible. I mean, the thing that I think prevents it is that love renders one vulnerable, right? Like I think that's the key part of it, is that uh, if you love, then you might be loved back, and that's not something. It's not a. It's unpleasant. I mean, it's pleasant in a certain way, but it's also like it's also disruptive, I think, or traumatic even. So, I think that's the rub. That you can, and because you love is the encounter. This is sort of psychoanalytic definition, but encounter between two lacks, right? And so uh, you both have to confront your own lack and then the lack in the other when the other loves you back, and that can be really hard to address and deal with.
Yeah, there's this concept that I got from the church fathers, that the experience of heaven and hell are both come from God's love, right? They're two sides of the same coin. And what determines the phenomenology of the experience of the grace of God, it can be traumatic, or it could be filled with bliss. And the difference is the human heart, right? It's your orientation towards this energy that comes to you, right? So it's interesting that our experience of both heaven and hell is mediated through God's grace from this perspective. And
But James, is there any bliss that's not traumatic?
well, it depends what we mean by traumatic.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, disruptive. Like it's so, yeah, it like throws you off, right? Like because it upsets your normal symbolic identity, right? Like I think that's what I would mean by traumatic, right? So it's always going to be throwing you off and not making you at home with yourself, right? And that's what I think is you mentioned Heidegger earlier. Like I think Heidegger is all about being rooted and being in one's place. And what's interesting to me about both Christianity and Hegel is it's about a kind of violent uprooting of one's place, right? And so that's what I mean. Like it doesn't, you don't, that's the traumatic part of it, right? Like even if you're feeling loved, it uproots you. It doesn't allow you to, you can't just feel like everything's going on as usual. You can't just, go out for a pizza and watch a movie because you're feeling totally different.
Yeah. Well, I think that's necessary for the transformation to happen, right? And
Yeah,
the
agreed.
transfiguration. So Christ
Yeah,
says, take up your cross and follow me, right?
yeah.
What is the cross? It's the torture machine, right? And he says, those that don't lose their life will never find me, right? So this sacrifice that Christ made through his own volition is the kind of the necessary aspect, I think, to get to what he's saying. And I'm not saying that I understand it. And it's going to be kind of traumatic, and it's going to be traumatic, like Christ's kind of death and resurrection was. And you go to psychoanalysis, you're dealing with trauma. When you go to psychotherapy in general, you're dealing with trauma, and it's about kind of appropriating that trauma in the right way. But there is a maybe bliss isn't the right word, or even joy. It's acceptance, maybe, and I think this acceptance is fractal as well. Like if from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, it's the way that you can increase this love and decrease the trauma from God's love that comes in is working through the passions. The passions they manifest through your sins, right? And they're not inherently bad, but they're kind of pressure points where that's where you need to do the work. That's where you need to do the work. Your sins are, where you're failing in your relationships. And I don't mean failing from a kind of a social perspective. That's where the work is to be done. And it's done over time through, through prayer and repentance, and metanoia from an Eastern Orthodox perspective. It takes time. If it happens too quickly, it's traumatic, and you could lose your identity, you could lose your life, right? So it's slowly working through your passions. It's slowly working through your enjoyment, right, over time. And in doing so, there's a transformation and a reorientation that happens in your psyche, and that is infectious, right? Because once it gets your psyche gets oriented more coherently, more appropriately, it fractally goes from you fix relationships, you don't resolve them, but you accept relationships with your parents, right? And that fractally, you help fix relationships within your community, and that scales out, right? So I think it has to happen at the individual level, and it has to be, they said that the line between good and evil is at the center of every human heart, right? If we take that seriously, the work is to be done through the contradiction that is central to our identity, and trauma is part of it. So when I said, I didn't mean to be kind of pedantic by saying, what do we mean by trauma? I meant that, we all have trauma, right, to different degrees and whatnot. And,
Right.
So I think it's interesting. I don't know that there's a question there or an answer to it there.
No, but I'll comment on that. Like, I
Yeah.
think it's an interesting distinction between Kant and Hegel, right? So Kant thinks we're constantly progressing. He even wrote a essay called Perpetual Peace, right? Like, so there's this constant progression toward something like flourishing, right? Hegel's idea is, okay, fine, you can progress, but with the more enjoyment, joy, whatever you get, the more trauma you get to, the more suffering you get to, right? So I think those are two different visions of things, right? And it seemed, I don't know, I mean, it's at some point you just have to choose. But I think Hegel's version is that there's no like he would never use a term like flourishing, just because, which is I know a common term today, because he would say, well, no, because the more you flourish, the more you suffer at the same time, right? Like that. I think that those two things for him are going to be intricately related, and you're never going to get one without the other. And I think that's the difference. Whereas Kant thinks there's this perpetual, not just social progress toward peace, but moral progress even, right? And so we're gradually able to kind of overcome these passion, like get accept our passions, understand that we have them, but then also have some moral purchase on them. So I think that to me, that's a pretty important distinction. And I would be more, if it were, I mean, I'm more on the Hegelian side of things, right? Like the more you even the more you learn to accept the passion, the more that actually you're going to get more suffering from that. So, and like the one way to think about it, you said like orient the relationships, right? Or I forget what the term you used.
Mm-hmm.
I think for Hegel would say we have to accept that they're disoriented, right? Rather than try to orient them correctly. And I think to me, that's a pretty crucial difference too.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I said, I said first I said fix, but then I said accept,
Yeah.
and I think that, we can speak to the kind of the Oedipal drama that our upbringing kind of, prefigures us, but there is this necessary reorientation to the familial relation that needs to be addressed, just psychologically. And
yeah, I totally agree with what you said. Like, I think
yeah.
that's totally right. Like, I think there is this, I mean, obviously certain parents need to be blamed and hated and for whatever, for certain reasons. But I think most of the time you have to come to this point at which you're like, look, I made myself what I am. And even the things that they did to me that I wish they didn't do, they helped to make me what I am. So I have to accept that. So I'm totally with you on that. Actually, I think that and I think that also in terms of relationships, it's a pretty good way to think about things, right? Like to think about the way in which the things that bother you about the partner are also the things that are integral to the thing that you love about them, right? So you can't, like, if you took away the thing that bothered you, then you would lose the thing that you loved it. So then you learn to accept the thing that bothers you. Like I have a son who's really creative guy, like he's really artistic, and he's not a great driver, but it's because he's like thinking imaginatively about things. And so I want to say, like, stop, like, don't drive the car so recklessly. And I do say that to him, but on the other hand, like, I have to accept that as part of the cost of like him being this imaginative artistic guy. So I think that I think that's important to think about acceptance in that way, that dialectical way too.
Yeah, I completely agree there. And I think, the sacrament of marriage, right? And, I've been married 10 years now, and, we see the increase in divorce 60, 70%, right? But some relationships are traumatic and terrible, and there's terrible people, and
Yeah, they should be left, right?
There should be
Absolutely.
separation.
Yeah.
But from this kind of orthodox perspective of marriage, the person you're married to reflects back to you your sin, right? The fight comes because you can't fix anything around the house. You're just like your father. And a lot of times, that if that causes obviously a marriage to break up, but that is the contradiction, that you've entered into this lifelong relationship with this other person. And that's the work of marriage, is done in that milieu, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it's synonymous to, how you said you were kind of working with your son, and I see it, right? Like, it's the whole trope of, if you go too hard, if you want them not to do this, right, there's a rebound effect that happens.
Absolutely.
But there's a way to orient yourself through that relationship where you're aware of that and can mediate it. But that comes from a spiritual maturity and a spiritual growth in yourself, right? Which I think, again, comes from the hard work of psychoanalysis, right? From the term of, the psyche means soul, right? The Greek term.
Yeah.
Psyche,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
right? And the analysis of the soul is an inventory of your relationship, the relationship you have with yourself, and the relationship you have with the other. But the other is our kids, the other is our wife, our partner, the other is the government, the other is the enemy, right? So this, again, from a Lacanian perspective, if I'm reading it right, the first other is the mother, and then that, right, is that right?
Yeah, no, I mean, he thinks that, yeah.
Or
But
the
I mean,
primary caregiver.
yeah, primary caregiver, because I think, right, you know, our twins, we basically like were half and half. So who would have been the primary, who would have been the mother in that situation? So I don't, that's why my own experience makes me a little like, I'm not so. But yeah, in terms of Lacan, you're absolutely right. So,
Yeah, and to stay there a little bit, the idea of the big other, and I think we talked earlier about, um, I think Lacan critiqued Christianity. He said it was the most potent religion ever, but he critiqued Christianity and he situated it in the imaginary, right? And I think we don't have time to get into this, but the Eastern Orthodox conception of the apophatic and cataphatic nature of God, right? The essence energies distinction. We cannot know God. God is beyond being, right? But we can know God through his energies, and his energies through the logi, through the created things in the world. And the idea that kind of came through is shifting the idea of God from the imaginary to the real, right? That shift turns the traumatic of the incursion of the real into the symbolic, into the grace of God, right? But that's going to be experienced depending on, let's say, spiritual maturity. That's going to be experienced as heaven or hell, right?
right.
And how do you know if you're falling into spiritual delusion or narcissism or whatever it may be? I think the only way
Well,
to markers there
right,
is the relationships that you have with at
right.
work, and it's not resolving or fixing them. It's the quality of the relationship that you have. Are they getting more enriched? Are they getting more are deeper? I don't know any other way to gauge, because I've had, I had, I really got into New Age spirituality. I had an awakening. I practiced Qigong and meditation for 6 years. I really had and I thought that, my idea was I'm going to help people heal themselves. And I started a business. I quit my 6-figure job, and I'm going to teach people meditation, and almost ruined my marriage, almost destroyed my life. But from the inside, it looked like I just want to help other people. I want to help other people heal themselves, meditation, these kind of yoga movements and whatnot. But that was an inflation of the spiritual ego. But from the inside, it looked like I just want to help people. So it's hard not to, and that's the way I kind of see ideology capture as well. You don't know when you're in another ideology. So how do you what can you use as a measure or a barometer? For me, at least right now, it comes to the quality of the relationships I have with my kids, my wife, people at work, the clerk at the Wawa, right? Am I present? Am I seeing the person there? And am I, and the more spiritual work you do, I think you can gauge the quality of the relationships, the conversations. You can feel conversations that you have with people. There's a quality to them, and you can feel it shift over time. And I don't know. I worry. I don't worry, but I'm careful that, now that I found Eastern Orthodox, my heritage, and how do I know I'm not making this idea of Eastern Orthodox into another spiritual delusion, another ideology, another way to invest my desire into an identity that eventually will pop as well, right? And it's something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fascinating question, and I do think that like what you said about the imaginary versus the real, I think is really important. Like, right, like that the when you're in a psychotic position, you're relating to only imaginary others.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the very resistance that the other puts up against what you're saying that actually is the proof that you're not delusional, right? Like, so if you're delusional, the other just kind of recedes and doesn't, they're just an imaginary foil for you. And so I think that's right. Like there's some kind of what Lacan would call rock of the real in the encounter with the other, which may not disturb you, but at least it's like, and you can call that like depth of conversation or whatever, but like something just sort of, you hit on something that doesn't just follow along with what you're trying to impose on it, right? And I think that's really the important thing. I also think that you never know, right, whether your project is delusional. And so I mean, this is a problem that stems to Descartes, right? Like he's like, how can I know that I'm not that like he had this great term, this melange, this evil genius. How do I know some melange didn't create everything to deceive me? And he kind of works his way out of it in a more or less convincing way. But I think that kind of doubt is really constitutive of who we are, and that we should engage in it almost all the time, right? Like, so that's part of what it means to even hold a project, is to be calling the project into question at all times. So I mean, you can't do it at all times, but constantly giving yourself this one over and saying like, is this really, and looking at other projects at the same time, right? Like I'm not, we talked a little bit about Deleuze, and, I'm no fan of Deleuze, but every year or so I read a book or reread a book by Deleuze, just to kind of reorient take Hegel's Greatest Enemy and, okay, where do I stand with this? And I think that's pretty, and even, real people that I'm opposed to, like Carl Schmitt, like I try to engage his thinking, or Heidegger, and I think there's something valuable in that in itself, but also it's a way to test and make sure you're, still questioning what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, bringing it back to the 10 Commandments, which again, 5 years ago, if you would have told me that I'm looking seriously, intellectually and spiritually at the 10 Commandments, it's like, you could use those as a measure as well, right? Am I jealous of my neighbor's new car? Do I have this ping of jealousy that pops up in me when when something good happens to a friend? Do I feel genuinely good about that? Or is this kernel of jealousy there? And it's not to completely extinguish that kernel of jealousy, but it's about orienting with it. It's about tearing with it. It's about looking at it and addressing it. Same thing. Right. You can be aware when you lie. We lie a lot, right? Yeah. Little stupid white lies, whatever it may be.
Sometimes we should lie.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Sometimes we should lie, right? Like someone says, how are you doing? You shouldn't tell them the truth about your condition, right? Like you should say, I'm fine. How are you? Right? Like that is a really good lie to tell, right?
Yeah. I think it depends on the context. If you're therapy, right?
If you're in therapy, that's a whole other thing. And if it's a close friend, that's a whole other thing. I'm talking about, you're walking down, see a friend or some acquaintance in the hallway. They don't want to hear you spill out, oh, my dog died today, and that's just, or even like, how does this coat look on me, right? Like, it's a good time to lie.
Yeah. I've thought about that one a lot. Or does this dress make me look fat? You're not the ultimate arbiter of that, so it's an opinion. Your opinion is not, it can't be a lie or not. I've been kind of working through that idea, but I think the important thing there is,
I think you're waffling a little bit, but from a Kantian perspective, I think he would not tolerate any of them.
Yep.
But I just think that not bearing false witness, I think what you're getting at, it has to be interpreted more capaciously, right? Like, not as this kind of strict to the letter of never telling the thing that you don't think, because for one thing, as you pointed out, you don't. How do you know? Are you the arbiter of what the thing looks like or not?
I think, and I don't know, right? So I like conversations where, I don't have a point of view and I'm trying to talk you into. I'm just, let's let what comes up and emerge there. The way that I would kind of think about it right now is, are you deceiving? Are you being deceptive?
Yeah. I think that's pretty good. I think it's pretty good.
Yeah. And I think that's, again, with, are you attracted to another man's wife, right? If you are, that's where work needs to be done. Not, and I think there's something there. There's so much, crap on top of these that it's hard to get to kind of the essence there to think through how working with this idea, this kind of right-wing or traditional idea of working with these these old archaic laws of the Ten Commandments, it's almost impossible to really parse through all of the the crap on top of it to get to what it could possibly mean for it's hard to even find a word, well-being, flourishing.
What about Kislovsky?
Yeah.
Have you seen the Decalogue?
Mm-mm.
Oh, because this is filmmaker Krzysztof Kislovsky, and he made a film called it's 10 1 hour little films, and it's called the Decalogue. And he basically, pretty great. He's trying to kind of come to terms with like what that would mean contemporarily. So
Is that you did the recent video on the senselessness of the law?
yeah.
Is that what you were referencing in that?
I don't think so. I mean, I might have had that in the back of my head, but I wasn't thinking of Kislovsky for sure. And I certainly wasn't thinking about the Ten Commandments. I was just thinking about sort of law as such. Even though I began with this joke about
The
from Mel
tablets.
Brooks, Moses dropping the tablets. Yeah, but it wasn't a Ten Commandments talk.
Yeah. He broke the tablets in 5 of the commandments.
Yeah, 5 are gone, and so he's like,
said,
these
there's 10.
15, no, these 10. Yeah. It's a
Yeah.
great moment, really. Yeah.
I found that funny, and I like that video, and it made me think. And again, I have these conversations that happen in the background, right? This idea of the Old Testament law, of there's 650 laws of relationship with pork and impurity and whatnot, and then the New Testament and Christ, he didn't come to overturn the law; he came to fulfill the law, right? It's like
Yeah. Don't you find it interesting that that's what Christ says? He says it in Matthew, and then maybe in Luke, I can't remember, by one other place, but definitely Matthew. And then Paul doesn't say that at all, right? Like Paul says, like the law is death, and the spirit is life, right? So it's interesting. Paul's kind of heretical, I think, on this question. I mean, I'm more on the side of Christ than on the side of Paul on this question. Like, I think that's a real, uh, uh, part of it is he's trying to not confine Christianity to Judaism, right? He's like trying to expand it so that he has to turn against the law. But I don't know. I feel like that there's something retrograde about that position that he has. So relative to Christ, who clearly insists, "I do not come to take away." Whoever takes away one bit of the law, there's all this, right? And so I think that that's really important. And then I think Paul doesn't really get that. So I think that's an error on his part, because I think you're right. Like what you were saying at the very beginning about 10 Commandments, I think there has to be, and in that essay that you referenced, like I was trying to get that the law has this structuring function, right? And so, but precisely that's nonsensical. So you can't ask behind it, like, oh, what's the reason for it? The foundation of law is just constitutive, right? And there's no, it's just that's why I said there's no legislator behind it. There's no reason behind it. It just constitutes us. And I think that Paul doesn't get that. And so there's something kind of psychotic about the Pauline universe, I think, unlike the Christian universe.
Yeah, I think this idea that there is no legislator, right? Again, from a Christian perspective, that the legislator of this world is Satan, right? And a quote from your book here, you say, "The adversary is a form, not a content, an absence rather than an identifiable enemy." I found that interesting, of this idea of evil doesn't exist. It doesn't have a ontological quality. It's kind of this absence. And you also talk about that if you transgress the law, you are within the logic of the law. You're still within the logic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Right. I think that's another, we talked a little bit before about the right left thing. I think there's been a whole, and that's what that chapter is about. There's been a whole leftist investment in transgression. Some guys even had me on their podcast to try to, I don't know, they rake me over the coals, but they're very invested in transgression as a leftist political activity. So I think that's not more and more, because May 68 was all about that. There's all kinds of movements historically where the left has been driven by transgression rather than social change, right? So
Hmm.
I think that's a problem. And I think for the reason you said, like, you're transgressing the thing, you're just as invested in it as someone who's trying to uphold it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think in that context, thinking about Christ fulfilling the laws is interesting. But in the 15 minutes, I'd like to end with some quotes and maybe some takeaways from the book. But I wanted to
Sure.
share with you some things that came to me that I understood about Christianity that changed my orientation. So reading it, I'm Greek, so I know Greek, and I'm read the Bible interlinearly. So the first chapter of John is in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? In English, it's like in the beginning was the Word. What a word in a sentence, letters strewn together and made meaning
Yeah.
out of. What do you mean by word? And what do you mean that the Word was with God and the Word was God? It doesn't have the pull. But in the Greek, it's in archi iton logos. So Inarchi is in the beginning, but it's the word arch, like archangel and archetype. So
Right.
Inarchi and logos, and the word is logos. So logos being the fundamental organizing principle of reality as such, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And this fundamental organizing principle of reality is both spatial, because the archetype, right, the beginning, the head, the top of the pyramid, right, the arch, right, but also
Mm-hmm.
it's temporal, right? So at the beginning of space and time was the logos, right? The fundamental organizing principle of reality as such. We can think of it as the Big Bang expanded at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Was
Mm-hmm.
that right? And
Yeah.
to wrestle with the idea is that Christ is the logos made manifest in human form. To really wrestle with that idea is something else, and I have no answer to that or any further words on that, but I'm genuinely trying to wrestle with that idea, and there's been, so I'll kind of leave that there. And another kind of distinction that
Can I
came
ask you a
to,
question quickly?
yes, sir, of course.
Yeah. So can you read Koine? Like, is modern close enough that you can just read it easily?
No, sometimes depends on
Okay.
the word,
Okay.
but yeah, the ancient Greek is different enough where it would take a lot of time to
Okay.
do that.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
yeah,
Because
and
I
so
studied Greek in college, but I tried to read some modern. I was just lost. So
yeah. Oh, really?
yeah. So
Okay.
yeah. So I could do. For me, it's the opposite. Like, I could have. I've kind of lost most of it now, but I
Yeah.
read the New Testament in a class. But then I tried to read something in modern Greek, and I'm just like, this is just, as they say, this is Greek to me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, even though I thought I read Greek. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if it were, because Koine is a little easier than Attic, right? So I wondered if it, but it's pretty hard
Yeah. And
for
I
for
speak
modern.
at Greek conversationally, but I technically, like, if I watch the Greek news, it's hard to catch everything that's coming at me. So even reading, I have to, take my time and kind of look up words. And I like looking up the etymology
Yeah,
of the word.
yeah,
It changes
yeah,
everything. Literally
yeah,
changes everything. And
yeah. I mean, there's a great. The one thing is that there's a great, the Little and Scott. It's a great Greek dictionary too. So we
mhm,
have in English a great Greek dictionary. I think,
yeah, for
like,
sure.
there's no equivalent in other. Like, I have a lot of French and German dictionaries, and they're the Little Scott. It's the gold standard, I think.
Yeah.
Or they added some other dude worked on it now, so there's another guy's name. But yeah,
So there's a lot there that we could get into with the idea
yeah.
of
Sorry
logo.
for that
Yeah,
interruption.
no, no, not at all. They have logos and language, right? And
Yeah,
the symbolic being structured through language, and the logos being
yeah,
the very fundamental sensibility or the ability to make sense of the word. And we can think of the critique of the West being foul logos centric. There's so much there, but I don't want to. Yeah, maybe 10 minutes of your time left. I want to
yeah,
just
yeah.
give you one more thing that came to me when I was researching kind of the history and this idea of Abraham and Isaac, and the idea that Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac to God, right? And what kind of God would ask, one of his disciples or to sacrifice his firstborn son? I'm like, what is this? What, how could that make sense? It turned me off. But then looking at the history of religions, right? Human sacrifice was ubiquitous. We find it in every culture, right? The way you would bless a building of a new home by sacrificing a child and putting it in the cornerstone, right? The history of the pagan world was sacrificing human beings, a lot of times children, right? The Aztecs, you see it in every culture, from the east to the west, from the Nordics, right? So it's like the idea of sacrifice was kind of the norm, right? And in this moment where God said, don't, right, stop, right? And the idea that Christ was the ultimate sacrifice, and what we do is eat from his flesh and his blood, right? That short circuits the history of human sacrifice, which was just the norm. So that kind of made me look at things differently. And then the idea that the Logos, right, was sprinkled in the world prior to Christianity in many different ways, right? The Hebrews had it, the Native Americans, the Hindus, the Buddhists, philosophers, right? The Logos is sprinkled everywhere, right? So I used to think, okay, I was born in a Christian world, therefore my particular religion is right. What are the chances of that? It seemed ridiculous. But this idea of that Christianity is not, it's not the only truth. It's the fulfillment of it's the fullness of the truth. And from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, every place in kind of Europe where Orthodoxy took root, it didn't efface the pagan gods. It didn't get rid of them. It oriented them appropriately, put them in the appropriate place in the hierarchy, and it transfigured them. So when from a Western Christian perspective, it's like, you believe that there was pagans and the old Greek gods. From an Eastern Orthodox perspective, yes, we do believe that there was these pagans and these other gods, and they are real. And the history of the world is the history of, a pagan god would be over a particular city, and then you would revere that god through sacrifice and other ways, and that god would show favor on you and your family depending on the quality of your sacrifice. Right? That was all changed in a very dramatic way, which shifted the world. In the Christian story, specifically through the reorientation of sacrifice and what that meant, and the ending of sacrifice by, go from human sacrifice to animals to incense, right? So it also goes from this idea of the harshness of the Old Testament God towards the more loving, gracefulness of the New Testament, right? I also see that going from human sacrifice to the sacrifice of incense, right? So there's this progression towards a more human oriented, and kind of the fundamentals of humanism are oriented in this way of the dignity of the human being, right? The way that the Romans thought of children, they were almost dispensable. They would put them outside the town if they didn't want them. Like they weren't thought of as actual human beings. They were thought of, and even a man and his wife, it was pretty much a slave,
Right.
But that was transformed through this meek impact of the Christian story, which is just, it's wrestling with that is profound. But there's no solution or consequence that could have come with. So I'm continuing to do that. I don't know if you wanted to speak to any of that before we kind of get to the last point here.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point about sacrifice is fascinating. That sacrifice is necessary to create transcendence, right? Like that like there's no sense of transcendent value without some kind of act of sacrifice. And I guess I'm a little less sanguine than you about the elimination of sacrifice. Like, I think, what's the prevailing religion today? It's capitalism, right? I think there's no question about that. And capitalism still, like, if there are 8-year-old kids down in 100-foot mines in Congo to obtain the metals for our phones, that's a sacrifice. So I'm not sure that we're not still creating, transcendent, godlike things through sacrifice. I think that's still going on today.
100% agree. And I think that there's a path to for that to, it's still happening, and it's intensifying with the religion of capitalism, the religion of kind of wokeness, right? And I think it's interesting, the story of the different qualities of sacrifice between Cain and Abel, right? God favored one sacrifice over the other.
Right.
but there's a lot more there we could get into. But let me finish up here 10 more minutes if you're good.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll read a few quotes from your book here, and we can kind of work through some of the implications. Which I really enjoyed the book. It was an interesting read. When you read something kind of and you just go through it. I love the points that were salient. I love the jokes. I love how the distinction of the chapters and your ultimate goal of kind of elucidating this the economy of political emancipation. I found it very interesting and a fun read even as well.
Thanks,
so let me
Jane.
just, yeah, of course. So let me orient us with a couple of quotes here. You say, recognizing the universality of non-belonging is the emancipatory project. And you have no social authority can produce complete belonging because there is no authorized authority that itself doesn't need to be authorized. We talked about earlier, but you have a footnote where you say the project of emancipation is universalist because it cannot leave some people out and remain emancipatory. Emancipation for some and not for others is not emancipation at all, but a prescription for an oppressive society. While universality has gotten a bad name since the failure of the communist experiment in the 20th century, it remains the foundation of the leftist project. A leftism that abandons universality for the emancipation of the particular has turned into its opposite. For more on the necessary universality of emancipation, see your book, Universality and Identity Politics. A couple more here, and then you have one can orient the social order by taking the point of contradiction as the locus for the order. This is the challenge for a society of emancipation. Let's just go at the very last sentence here, right? You say when we can enjoy our non-belonging, we advance in the terrain of emancipation. If you can, this thing, contradiction, enjoyment, non-belonging, the politics of emancipation, like, can you get to what that would practically look like? What is a practical?
Yeah. People ask me that all the time. Yeah, James, it's a good question. Yeah, I think part of what it would practically look like is the end of Heathers, right? Like that there's this way in which the figure, like there still would be, obviously, I don't think it's possible to orient a society without a structural position of belonging. So it exists as a form, but no one necessarily occupies it, or there's no privilege attached to occupying it, right? And so there would be a egalitarianism of non-belonging. Like there wouldn't be, I think it would be a society in which there'd be no sense of like, I want to get ahead, because you realize there's nothing to getting ahead. Like there's nowhere to get ahead to, right? So I think I'm talking about it psychically, not structurally, because I don't know how to make political prescriptions, and I don't even think that would be my province, but that would be what it would, to me, look like psychically. And I think that it also would be some kind of internalization. The one joke I've told too many times, so I'm not going to tell it, but there's a joke, I think, toward the end of this book, or maybe it's a different book, but so a guy is, and I think this kind of captures this idea. There's a guy golfing, and he has a ball, and he says to his friend, "You really should try this new golf ball I have." Is this in this book?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. So he goes, "You should try this new golf ball I have because it's amazing." And the guy's like, "Well, really, what's so good about it?" He goes, "Well, if you hit it in the tall grass, it shines a light, and you can see it. If you hit it in the water, it floats right back to you. And if you hit it into the woods, it emits a sound, and you can find it." And the guy, his friend, the golfer, is like, "Wow, that's amazing! It's amazing. Where'd you get that ball?" And the guy goes, "I found it." So what I love about that joke is that this perfect thing, there's a contradiction there, right? Because the perfect thing has to be lost in order to be, so someone did lose it, this unlosable golf ball. And I think that kind of captures, to me, both contradiction and also the universal like the impossibility of belonging. Like there can't be this perfect position. Everybody's really at the perimeter. Everybody's in the position of non-belonging. So I one of my favorite things is the joke that makes the nice theoretical point. So I think that one kind of hits it.
Yeah, it made me think of being in the world, but not of it, like belonging, but
I,
non-belonging, but not
I,
belonging.
yeah,
And I don't mean to
James,
reduce the ideas to that. I'm just
no, no,
putting them in
no,
dialogue.
no.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could summarize the entire book with that line, right? Like
Mhm.
that is the line. That is the idea. That is absolutely the idea, right? Like that is. I think that in the world, but not of the world, is universal non-belonging. I think that's the Christian prescription, right? Absolutely.
Thank you. I guess finally here, our current political situation, the way it's oriented, I've seen it invert dramatically. Now it's just kind of spiraling. Are you optimistic about the near, medium, and long-term future?
I don't know. It's hard to be optimistic. I guess I don't know. I mean, there's certain things that I have to say that the Ukraine resistance and the way people have come together about that makes me optimistic for that. Uh, but I mean, on every other issue, I don't see how it's very easy to be optimistic, right? Like it seems like, but again, like maybe just like you were talking about with the church, like maybe the catastrophe then kind of you never know what's going to give birth to something, is it William Butler Yeats, a terrible beauty is being born, right? Like I think who knows what's going to happen, but I think it doesn't seem like it seems pretty dim right now. But
Yeah, yeah, it does. And I don't know if it's actually dim, or I don't know if we've like crossed the singularity of AI, where what we see coming through Twitter and through our screens, that it's like the end of the world is coming. Is this like kind of an AI psyop where to make you kind of in this hyper state of agitation all the time? Uh,
yeah,
when I look around me, people, friends, family, physical reality, I become more optimistic. But when I go on Twitter, it just it breaks my heart. But it's a contradiction.
yeah, yeah,
It's a
yeah. That's
contradiction.
true. That's
Yeah.
true. That's
I,
true. I would just say people shouldn't be on social media. I think it's kind of bad, actually. Yeah, I think it's
yeah.
not. I think the problem with it is that it. Here's I'll put it in the kind of technical terms. Like I think it pretends to be a big other, but it's really like a massive superego. Like you
Hmm.
go on there, you feel this intense pressure to be someone else, doing something, doing more, doing what the other person's doing, attacking this thing. Like you constantly feel under super egoic pressure, and so there's not this just you know neutral other that's there to be received.
Is there a way to
But
reorient these technologies?
maybe. I mean, I think they should all be made public for one thing. Like
Mhm.
I think there should be no profit on them. There should be no ads on them. There should be public entities. That's one thing I firmly believe. So, and then I might even join one. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I got young kids and them with the screens.
It's
It's
disastrous. It's a
insurmountable.
disaster.
It
It's
feels
it, it is really
insurmountable.
horrible because the worst thing is I don't want to mean to sound like an old person, but it becomes impossible to read. Like
Hmm.
I even find myself, and I'm not on any social media. I just I'm on internet and email, and I get like distracted from my like I'm trying to read Hegel, and I get distracted from that. So I too feel the same thing. And if I feel it, I think I'm one of the most disciplined, like readerly people there is. So if I feel it, imagine what the kids that grow up with that are trying to overcome. I think about that every time I yell at my students for not doing the reading. I still yell at them, but
Yeah.
I'm very sympathetic.
Yeah. And finally here, like McLuhan said that, the next after World War II, World War III will be an informational warfare, which I see as spiritual warfare. And the distinction between civilian and soldier will be blurred. And then
Yeah,
that will completely be blurred. And I think we're in some kind of event like that. Definitely interesting time to be alive.
yeah.
But Todd, you've been more than gracious with your time. I thank you. Beautiful conversation, and I hope to maybe connect with you again. I'll put a link to all
Any
your stuff as well.
Okay. Anytime, James. It was great talking to you. Thanks a
Thank you.
lot.
Yeah. Have a good rest
Take
of your
care.
day. God
Okay.
bless. Yeah. Bye.
Okay. You too. Bye.